Comrades and friends, brothers and sisters, I'm really going to continue along the theme of the meeting as we've discussed, has been discussed so far by Evelyn and Michelle. If we remember back a few years ago, some people may remember, some people may not, but after the 9/11 attacks, George W. Bush, that brilliant person, former president, was asked the question, why do they hate us? And he responded, he said, why do they hate us? They hate our freedom. He actually said that. They hate our freedom. That's why there was this anger. He and many others went on to explain that the hostility toward the United States around the world is the proof of the existence of evil in the world. In other words, this is a kind of a theological explanation for things. You know, you take evil and put a D in front of it and you have devil. And that's really what was going on, is that was devils in the world, or people who were instruments of the devil. And as well as we talked about it in the first half of the meeting, there's a little bit more to it than that. And I want to go into a little bit of about a couple of countries that have been targeted. And whether it's a Democrat or a Republican in the White House, the presentation of the motivations for U.S. foreign policy, which are always faithfully transmitted by the corporate media, all of them, has as its underlying assumption, its main assumption, that U.S. intentions are at all times good, that they're honorable, that they're seeking to defend democracy, human rights, women's rights, et cetera, et cetera. And those same assumptions, and I would say that this is invariably true, that it doesn't matter when you come to the mainstream media, the corporate media, it doesn't matter whether it's Fox or it's PBS or NBC or CBS or CNN, there's always that assumption that's at work. And it's very insidious. And the same assumptions of goodness are transferred to U.S. allies, particularly to Israel and Great Britain. But they can also be transferred to any NATO ally or any lackey government that lines up with the United States at any given time. In fact, that's the ticket to be part of the international community, quote unquote. That's how you get into the international community. And if you don't, it doesn't matter how big your country is or how many countries don't agree with it, they are not in the international community as it's presented to the people in the United States. And it has a big impact on people. It has, even people who are very well-intentioned. Like yesterday I was speaking about Syria and Iraq and Iran at City College in San Francisco, and it was a progressive group of students and teachers, but there's always that, well, we have to do something idea. And the we is, of course, not the we who are sitting there in the room, because the we who are sitting there in the room don't have the capacity to do that. It's like the idea that the U.S. government has to do something. And the reason that you would think that the U.S. government should do something is because it's good and honorable and its intentions are always pure. So I'd like to just go a little bit more into some of the background about particularly three countries, Iraq, Iran, and Syria, and what the real role of the U.S. and the British and its other allies have been. I think people know that in Iraq, most people here know that Iraq emerged as a modern country out of the old Ottoman Empire. And it was 3 provinces of the Ottoman Empire. And it emerged out of World War I. And during World War I, the British, who were the dominant and rising power in the Middle East, made promises to Arab leaders. This is the nascent period of the Arab national movement, that if they would fight on the side of Britain and France in the First World War, that the British would support the right of independence when the war was over. And when the war ended, there was a lot of organizing, and motion in the Arab countries that were just emerging. But the British and the French had made their own deal between themselves while offering these promises, And that deal was called the Sykes-Picot Treaty. And the Russian Empire had been in on it. And they talked about how they would divide up the Middle East among themselves. And the British would get Palestine and Jordan and Iraq, or most of Iraq. And the French would end up with Lebanon and Syria. And Russian Empire would get a lot of Turkey. And Turkey would basically be dismantled as a country. And perhaps not only the Ottoman Empire, but Turkey itself. And Greece was going to get part of it, and Italy was going to get part of it, and all this. And so this was the real deal. And then the Russian Revolution happened in 1917. So the new government in Russia not only renounced this idea, but they published the treaties. That's how the world found out about it. And that's how the Arab people and the other people in the Middle East found out that this was going on. But nevertheless, the British moved into Iraq, and there was a big uprising in 1920, and it was crushed with 10,000 Iraqis killed, 2,000 British troops. And there was then rebellion after rebellion after rebellion in Iraq. In 1925, the British had, as a precedent, the first to drop poison gas from planes was dropped by the British on the Kurdish people in Iraq who were then in revolt. Winston Churchill said at the time, and other leading officials like Lawrence of Arabia, the great champion of the Arab people, said, I don't know why there's all this big stir about using gas on the ends, because they referred to a lot of their colonial people using the N word. In the newspapers of Britain, the honorable newspapers, the Times of London and so forth. In 1927, there was finally an agreement. It took a long time to reach the agreement called the Red Line Agreement. And the Red Line Agreement was about who was going to get Iraq's oil. And who got the oil of Iraq, and here's how it was divided. It was 23.75% went to Dutch oil companies, 23.75% to French, same to the British, and same to the United States, who had never had a soldier in the Middle East. But that was part of the considerations that were given to U.S. imperialism for having entered the war on the side of the British and French. And then the last 5% went to the guy who made the deal, Kolos Gulbenkian, known in history as Mr. 5%er. He made some other deals where he got 5% too. And so that left Iraq with what percentage of Iraq's oil? Zero, exactly zero. And from then on until 1958, there were rebellion after rebellion in 1936, and 1941, and 46, 48, 52, 56, and finally 58, 1958. It was a revolution and overthrew the puppet king and kicked the British out. And at that time, after all this time, with all of its oil wealth, Iraq was a country that where the indices for living for people were comparable to what they are in Afghanistan today. Illiteracy, lack of medical care, the infant mortality rates. With all that oil wealth, because none of the wealth went to Iraq. It went all to the foreign country. Iraq, now having taken over the oil, even though it wasn't really a socialist society, it was a kind of a social democratic, nationalist government that came into being, developed very, very rapidly in terms of electrification and literacy and providing food for people and clean water and built up an education system, built up a healthcare system, and so forth. In 1980, after the fall of the Shah of Iran in the 1979 revolution, the U.S. and its allies encouraged Iraq to then go to war against Iran and provided Iraq with a great deal of military help. Later, they provided Iran with some military help, too, because the real intention, which they weren't too shy about talking about, some of the politicians who were out of office then, like Henry Kissinger, was to have those two countries destroy each other. Because they are the two main independent countries in this oil-rich Gulf region. More than 1 million people died in the war that lasted for 8 years, a terrible war, and both countries were weakened by it. In 1990, after a long dispute between Iraq and Kuwait, Iraq occupied Kuwait. I will tell you that if you go to Iraq, when we went to Iraq, every person there, no matter whether they were, what their nationality inside of Iraq, if they were Kurdish or Arab or Turkoman, they all believed that Kuwait was part of Iraq and should have been historically. And in response to this, the U.S. 4 days later pushed through a complete blockade, the most complete blockade of a country in modern history. And 6 months later, 500,000 U.S. troops and thousands of airstrikes destroyed most of Iraq's civilian infrastructure, including food production and water and sewage and everything, power, phones, all this, supposedly because Iraq's troops were in Kuwait. It didn't really compute if you thought about it. It had a different purpose, in other words. From 1990, as was mentioned earlier, to 2003, the sanctions, which were a polite term for a genocidal blockade, killed more than 1 million. And it's important to know that while some of us here campaigned to make the sanctions a public issue, it was very little known in the United States most of the time. But it was very well known in the Middle East, and particularly in the Arab countries, who were seeing every day the images of the incredible suffering that was imposed, the hundreds of thousands of Iraqi children who were dying needlessly just because they couldn't get clean water because of the blockade, because they didn't have enough medicine, because they didn't have enough food. And it was revealed by the U.S. government inadvertently in 1996 that this was an intentional policy against Iraq. When Madeleine Albright was interviewed by a reporter on 60 Minutes, Leslie Stahl, who had just come back from Iraq, and who was very shaken by what she saw, as everybody, if you actually went and saw what it was unbelievable. Because you could see the modern facilities, and you could see that there was nothing. There was nothing in the pharmacies and so forth. And she was asked the question, 500,000 Iraqi children dead, is it worth the price? And she said, this is a hard decision for us, but yes, it's worth the price. We think it's worth the price. That's an interesting, very interesting statement, which also constitutes a confession to war crimes. And during the same period, the U.S. and British warplanes patrolled the no-fly zone, as they called it, which was almost the entire country of Iraq. Iraq wasn't allowed during all that time to have civilian airliners. They couldn't fly, and it was a no-fly zone for Iraqis. But every day they patrolled, and sometimes the Iraqis would shoot at them, but no U.S. or British planes, and it was the U.S. and Britain, surprised, who were doing this. None of them were shot down during that time. But I heard Colin Powell, who has kind of this undeserved reputation as being sort of the nice guy of the Bush administration, the other day saying, well, they were questioning him about the lead-up, and he said, well, they were shooting at our planes every day. Well, you were flying over their country every day. That's why they were shooting. It wasn't like they'd come to New York and set up an anti-aircraft battery. And when this didn't achieve the desired and stated objective of regime change, which was the U.S. official policy, then Iraq was invaded in 2003, occupied, more than a million more people plus killed. We don't know how many wounded, 4.5 million displaced. 30% of the entire population was killed, wounded, or displaced between 2003 and 2011. And the country was ripped apart and remains to a large degree that way. With all the death and the misery it imposed, mainly on the Iraqi people, but also on hundreds of thousands of U.S. troops who were really pawns in another imperialist war, the U.S. did not win the war in Iraq or anything close to it. That's obvious today when the government that the U.S. helped to install is allowing Iran to ship material through its airspace, and I think also by land, to Syria. But the crimes that were done to Iraq are burned into the consciousness of people throughout the Arab world and the Muslim world and much of the rest of the world, everyone who knows about it and who stands for justice. Iran became a colony in everything but name of the British Empire more than 100 years ago. Its importance to Britain was greatly heightened by the switchover of the British Navy, I don't know exactly when that was, about 100 years ago, just before World War II. Before World War I started, from coal to oil. And the British Empire was kept alive by the British Navy. It was the biggest navy in the world at the time. And the Secretary of the Navy, or Minister of the Navy, whatever it's called, was Winston Churchill, another guy with a very undeserved good reputation. And the British government controlled was it called Anglo-Persian Oil Company at the time? And it brutally exploited the huge oil resources. They knew about Iran's oil before the other countries in the Middle East. And the oil workers lived in the most horrendous imaginable conditions. They basically lived in oil, they and their families, in the tin shacks, in intense heat, paid 50 cents a day for their work. And Britain grew very, very rich. In fact, it moved Churchill, the great Democrat, to once say that Iran was a gift from fairyland beyond our wildest dreams. A gift from fairyland beyond our wildest dreams. About that time. Skipping ahead, after World War II in 1951, when the first government was elected, which was referred to earlier, the Mossadegh government came in and had the gall to nationalize the oil company, which I think by then was called Anglo-Iranian. Is that they changed the name? Anglo-Iranian, and to try to use the oil to build up Iran, which was in extremely, most of the people were in extreme poverty. And in retaliation for that, the US and the British put an oil embargo, that it became almost impossible for Iran to sell its oil in the world market. And I think it was the New York Times that made a reference to, I don't have the exact words, but this is when the coup happened, this showed, should show other countries in the world that they better not try to engage in resource nationalism. In other words, using their own resources for their own benefit. That's the New York Times, that great bastion of something. And in 1953, the combined efforts of the US and British intelligence services put the Shah back on the throne. They brought in a guy from New Jersey named Norman Schwarzkopf, who was the father of the general who in 1990, the head of the US Army, Norman Schwarzkopf Jr., or the second or the third or whatever. They brought him in from this New Jersey State Police to train the secret police of Iran, who became utterly infamous, the Savak, and who over the next 25 years, while the Shah remained in power, would kill, it's estimated, as many as 100,000 Iranians, many of them tortured to death, and most of them young people who were against the regime. And the masses of Iranian people were subject to great suffering and to the humiliation of a new form of new colonialism, but this time it was as part of the US empire. The Shah's regime, together with Israel, in the late 1960s became the powers patrolling the Middle East, putting down popular rebellions until the revolution of 1979 overthrew the Shah and ended US domination of the country. Almost immediately, the US put sanctions in place against Iran after the revolution, and now for the last several years has been working to impose more and more severe economic sanctions on the country. And what's the justification for that? That Iran could develop a nuclear weapon. It could. I mean, this is the country that's the only one that's ever used nuclear weapons, that has thousands of them, that has its ally Israel, that has hundreds of nuclear weapons. The other countries have nuclear weapons, but Iran must be subject to extreme punishment now because it could develop nuclear weapons, although its government says over and over again that it's not, and that it's only developing nuclear power for peaceful purposes. It's not really about the nuclear weapons, of course. It's about trying to destroy Iran as an independent country. They want to destroy Iran as an independent state, just as they did Iraq in 2003. Why? Because in seeking the total domination of the oil-rich and key strategic region, US policy has been to crush all independent states and popular movements that defy Washington. That's the real reason here. Now, apparently, in response to the economic hardships that are being imposed by the sanctions, there are demonstrations in the last days in Iran protesting inflation and the government's crackdown on illegal currency transactions, which are causing even more inflation, and which any government has to try to control. So today you can see that US officials are getting excited about this development. They're hoping that this is leading where they want it to lead, that by imposing all this suffering on the people in Iran, and people are dying because they can't import certain kinds of medical supplies, that the price of food is going up. They're hoping that this will bring discontent within the country by causing suffering to the people. But if it doesn't bring about regime change by itself, which is unlikely, what they hope instead is that it will weaken the country in preparation for whatever the next step will be. And this is what was done, of course, in regard to Iraq in most extreme fashion. And at the same time, as they are saying, well, let's have the sanctions work, U.S. leaders from Hillary Clinton to Barack Obama to Mitt Romney never tire of repeating this phrase, that no options are off the table when it comes to Iran. And what that translates into is not only a threat of war, but it's an explicit threat of nuclear war against Iran, that nuclear weapons can be used against Iran. And now we want to show a short video clip of Hillary Clinton, the current Secretary of State, and James Baker, who was Secretary of State during the first war against Iraq, on the Charlie Rose show in June. We're just going to show 1 minute of it. But it's a telling minute.
Contain will not work.
I agree with that. My personal position on that is this. We ought to try every possible avenue we can to see if we can get them to correct their desire and goal of acquiring a nuclear weapon, but we cannot let them acquire that weapon. We are the only country in the world that can stop that. The Israelis, in my opinion, do not have the capability of stopping it. They can delay it. There will also be many, many side effects, all of them adverse, from an Israeli strike. But at the end of the day, if we don't get it done the way the administration is working on it now, which I totally agree with, then we ought to take them out.
Take your time.
They're not supposed to act like that in public, actually, but at least Hillary's not supposed to. So, I mean, that's really, kind of the face of imperialism that is usually made to look different than that. I want to say a little bit about Syria, because now, Syria is a major focus and the real possibility of a new military intervention coming. Maybe not before the election, maybe before the election in a different form, maybe after the election. But Syria was part, to go back for a minute to the period after World War I, when some of the Arab leaders at the time believed that the British promises were real. In Syria, there was a state created in 1919 by the General Syrian Congress that included not only what is present-day Syria, but also Lebanon and Palestine and part of Jordan. Delegates came from all those areas to Damascus. They met in this Congress. They declared a new state, a constitutional monarchy. And then the French troops came in and with a great brutality, put them down and put down the Lebanese and the British put down the Palestinians who rose up. And so that happened in 1920, and then Lebanon and Syria became colonies. In 1925, there was, I don't have it with me, but there was a very graphic description of what the French did in one of the many rebellions that took place in Syria, which included almost all the tactics that the Israelis use against the Palestinians: house demolitions, preventive indefinite detention of people, executions, and so forth. And this went on in 1940. The French regime collapsed. And France, a large part of France, was occupied. In 1946, Syria became officially independent. In 1948, in one of its early actions, the CIA carried off a coup in Syria, which ushered in a period of instability in the country. In 1963, the Arab Ba'ath Socialist Party came to power, which means Arab Socialist Renaissance Party, is what Ba'ath translates as, and Syria began to go in a very leftist direction. The left wing of the Ba'ath Party talked about creating a workers' and peasants' state. And in Washington, some began to call Syria the Cuba of the Middle East. And so in 1967 was the US-backed Israeli war, this lightning strike against Syria, Jordan, and Egypt, which largely destroyed the air forces and a lot of the military of those countries. Gerald Ford, who would later become president, talked about, Israel is really doing a great job for us there. That ushered in a more moderate government in Syria, a more moderate wing of the Ba'ath Party took over the 67 war, and also what happened in 1970 in what is called Black September, the crushing of the Palestinians and the defeat of Syria in trying to support them at that time. The left wing was pushed out, and the Hafez al-Assad came in. Hafez al-Assad came in as the president, and that was considered a good thing from the U.S. point of view. And this is the father of the present President Bashar al-Assad. A good thing, better for them than the former government, but still they knew that Syria was still an independent country. Syria had a very mixed relationship with imperialism over the next 25 years. At sometimes resisting imperialism, at sometimes collaborating with imperialism. But it wasn't never a client state that would take orders from Washington. On August 10th, 2003, John Bolton, who was, what was he called then? He was Undersecretary of State for Arms Control or something like that, which is a very funny title for John Bolton, who was for arms control of people the U.S. didn't like, but that was it. But one of the most extreme neocon elements. He rushed right out the day after the fall of Baghdad to make a speech saying that Syria, Iran, and North Korea should learn the lessons of Iraq. And it was about a little less than 2 years later that the regime change campaign against Syria went into high gear in regard to developments that were going on in Lebanon. And it was a campaign both to bring about regime change in Syria and bring down the progressive resistance movement, the popular resistance movement inside Lebanon. And it didn't work then. And the main things that prevented it from working was the rise of the resistance in Iraq and the strength of the movement inside Lebanon. And the U.S. had to back off on, the U.S. and the French, the former colonizers, they had to back off for a little while. With the Arab Spring, the U.S. has worked to manage the transition in countries that were longtime allies and were overthrown or forced out in Egypt, Tunisia, and Yemen. But in regard to Syria, the U.S. saw the new opportunity for regime change that could fundamentally change the balance of forces in the region. The U.S. did not initiate the movement in Syria, the protest, but they and their allies, particularly France, the former colonizer, Britain, and Turkey, have thrown their full support to the opposition. They are doing this in the name of democracy and human rights. And also playing a key role are Qatar and Saudi Arabia, particularly in providing weapons, which they themselves acquired from the United States. So it's really, just really the U.S. weapons being routed in a slightly different pattern. The idea of mentioning Qatar, Saudi Arabia, and democracy in the same sentence is actually quite laughable. As a Syrian official said a few months ago, when being attacked at a meeting of the Arab League by a Saudi diplomat, he said that it's really quite something that a country that doesn't allow women to attend soccer matches would lecture us about democracy. But it's not just soccer matches. Women are not allowed to drive cars in Saudi Arabia, and they're even not supposed to be outside in public without being accompanied by a male relative. There's never been an election in Saudi Arabia. It's ruled by hereditary monarchy and is a notoriously brutal police state. But going back to the idea of how the language is presented to us at the media here, Saudi Arabia is always a moderate Arab country, and these conditions of extreme repression are rarely highlighted in the corporate mass media. Syria occupies a very key strategic position. We don't have a map up there, but I think most people here can visualize where it is, that it borders Turkey, Lebanon, Palestine, Jordan, and Iraq. It's the most central country in the Levant region of the Middle East. A pro-Western regime, if it's brought in Syria, would open the country up to U.S., French, and other Western capitalist penetration to the great detriment of the Syrian people. That has not really happened in any kind of full way so far. It's interesting, the last time I went to the Middle East was to Syria in December in 2005. I don't know how it is really now, but then there were, no Kentucky Fried Chicken, no McDonald's, there were no advertisements for any Western products, and it has opened up some, but it's nothing like what would happen if there was a pro-Western, pro-imperialist regime. It also would isolate the Hezbollah-led resistance bloc in Lebanon, and it would weaken Iran. And I think it was mentioned earlier that, in fact, the regime of Saudi Arabia itself is another crime of imperialism against the people of the Middle East, of the Arab people. It was either just before he was elected or right after he got elected that Ronald Reagan, back in 80 or 81, said that the policy of the United States was no revolution in Saudi Arabia. So that's an interesting foreign policy position, No matter how bad it is, because they're, doing what we want them to do in regard to oil, you'll just have to live with it, people of Saudi Arabia. Other people can have revolutions. We can have a revolution even in the United States, but I'm sorry, our policy is you can't have one. So the reason why, and this is just some of the other crimes were mentioned earlier against the people of the region. So the real reason that there's so much anger, and the underlying anger is hardly a mystery. And it has nothing to do with the profoundly racist arguments put forward by U.S. political and military leaders. I say profoundly racist because they are really advancing the old colonial justifying idea of, quote unquote, the other. That the people in Pakistan or Libya or Iraq or Palestine or anywhere that we're talking about are irrational, ignorant, less than human. In reality, there's nothing quite as ignorant or irrational as the statement, why do they hate us? They hate our freedom. The racist demonization of a targeted country or people or leader is a necessary step. It's an absolutely necessary step in the preparation for war. That has been true since the founding of the United States. There has never been a war that was not accompanied by a demonization of the people that the war was to be fought against, or the country, or the leader of the country. So am I supposed to stop in how many minutes?
Yeah. How many do you think?
3? Maybe 2 or 3? Okay. And this is true since the founding of the United States, whether the target was the native people, who were intensely demonized, the Mexicans in 1846. I went to, a couple years ago, I went to Austin, Texas, and I went to the state. I was taken there by a comrade there to the state capitol, and they have giant murals inside the state capitol that depict the independence war of Texas and the Mexican war. And the faces of the Mexican soldiers actually look like animals. That's how they were depicted. The Spanish in 1898, the Germans in World War I, the Japanese in World War II, the Koreans in the Korean War in 1950, the Vietnamese, Noriega of Panama, Saddam Hussein, Muammar Gaddafi, and today Bashar al-Assad in Syria and President Ahmadinejad in Iran. It's over and over and over again. It's a pattern that has been highly developed and highly refined. And all through the history of the United States, the dehumanization of black people was used as the justification for slavery, segregation, lynching, and today for mass incarceration and rampant police brutality. It's used to justify this whole notion, if you really think about it, it's quite profound in that that idea that somehow the U.S. intentions are always good and honorable, and that it's really looking out for the well-being of the people of the United States and the people of the world, also underlies the idea of American exceptionalism. That the United States is somehow different, and the people that live in the United States are somehow different than everybody else in the world. I mean, it's very interesting that at the Republican convention, they actually had the nominating speech for, was it for Romney? I think it was, Marco Rubio, the Cuban-American senator. He was actually assigned the topic of American exceptionalism. That was his talk. I mean, they were saying on TV, he's going to speak about American exceptionalism when he introduces Romney. But that idea of American exceptionalism is used to justify the 900 U.S. military bases around the world. To tell people, we're in danger and we're better. And so everyone has to support this. We have to support this. I mean, the most outrageous things, that go along with it is that a few years ago, the U.S. Pentagon created something called AFRICOM. What does that mean? I mean, the U.S. has a military command structure for Africa. Yes, they do have a military command structure for Africa, and now they have bases all over Africa. In 2008, they revived the Fourth Fleet that went out of being in the early 1950s. That's for Latin America. So that's, And why are there U.S. military bases all over Germany and Japan 67 years after the end of World War II? All over, and U.S. military bases all over many other countries, particularly in the Middle East, in Turkey, in Bahrain, in Qatar, in Kuwait, major U.S. military operations. And are they really there protecting democracy? I don't think so. So we have to reject this and fight against it, this idea, to understand the reality and be able to explain it, which I think the talks in the meeting tonight are doing, which is to explain why there is such great anger toward the United States around the world, and why the anger is not irrational or anything like that. It's completely justified, and that anyone who has suffered under imperialism and colonialism would feel the same way. And we have to reject all forms of racist demonization, and always, and I think, talk to people about when a particular leader is being held up, and demonized. What does that really mean, and what's the real purpose there? Back at the time of Iraq and the sanctions, we would say, that Saddam Hussein has been so demonized that it's not just he who has been demonized, it's all of Iraq that has been. And you could try going out on the street and say to people, let's do a word game. I say a word, you say a word. If I say Iraq, you say Saddam Hussein. If I say Saddam Hussein, you say Iraq. They became interchangeable and indistinguishable. So we reject all of this, and we reject any idea, any of the ideas that underline it. And the way to answer it, though, is the struggle itself. And that's why tomorrow, we will be going out in the streets again. We hope everyone will join us. And one of the placards that the PSL will bring to the march, I think, is most appropriate in explaining the core of our view, and that is, it says at the top, banks, Pentagon CEOs, the real enemy is at home. Thanks.